Hello my lovelies and welcome to another Rewind review. Did I really just say that? In this video we are going back further than we have ever been before on this channel to take a look at the one that started it all. And that is Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Released in 1937 and based on the Grimm Fairy Tale, the first full-length animated movie sees a princess who is exiled into the dangerous forest by her wicked stepmother, being rescued by 7 dwarf miners who form a friendship with her and make her a part of their household. The movie was supervised by David Hand with sequence directors William Cottrell, Wilfred Johnson, Percy Pearce and Ben Sharpstein, and adapted by Ted Sears, Richard Creedon, Otto Englander, Dick Rickard, Earl Hurd, Merrill Demaris, Dorothy Ann Blank and Webb Smith, and stars a host of uncredited voice talent. Yes, really. I've not long found this out, but apparently what the early Disney animated movies did was they did not credit their voice talent to try and maintain the illusion of the movie. That's mad. I didn't know anything about that and I really hope that they got paid properly. Anyway, it's mad to think, especially if you're a part of my generation or even parents' generation, that there was a time where there was no such thing as animated movies. Sure, animation was around in the 1930s and even earlier, but most of it was just relegated to shorts. At that point in time, there had never been a full-length feature film created entirely using 2D hand-drawn animation, and that's something that Walt Disney was trying to achieve. And he wanted to make an animated feature that would not only get people invested in the characters and the story, but make them cry. Disney animation was very experimental in the early days, with things like Steamboat Willie being among the very first fully synchronized sound cartoons. But this movie was a huge gamble that Disney was taking, to the point where a lot of people had no faith in it. In fact, Snow White was referred to as Disney's folly when it was in development, and critics were adamant that audiences won't be able to stand the bright colours and jokes for a full-length film. This is all true, by the way. Walt Disney not only had a lot to prove with this movie, but he had a lot on the line for this. In fact, he even mortgaged his own family house in order to fund this. And fortunately for him, not only was this movie a success, it helped build up the foundations of Walt Disney Animation Studios, and it even laid the groundwork for the studio location where it was that they were going to produce all their content. This movie even won an honorary Oscar, back when the Oscars actually meant something. And what was unique about this particular award was it was a traditional golden Oscar statue and 7 mini ones as well. That's really cool. Now, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is a movie that I have seen many times over the years, but mainly when I was a kid. I haven't seen this movie in a really long time, but I was quite keen to revisit it at some point. I'll admit, the movie wasn't a favourite of mine, but I did like it and I did enjoy it. So I decided to dig out my old Disney DVD of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which I completely forgot not only comes with a collector's edition of the movie, it actually comes with a little behind the scenes book, and it's got all like the artwork and the designs that went into making the film, and I sat down to rewatch it. So, is it still good? Does it still have the ability to charm, or is it simply a product of its time? Let's take a look at Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The movie is a retelling of the classic fairy tale which sees Snow White forced to run away into the dark forest after her wicked stepmother, the evil queen, becomes jealous of Snow White being declared the fairest one of all and wants her killed. And while on the run, Snow, led by friendly woodland creatures, discovers a small cottage inhabited by 7 dwarfs, who welcome her in, make her a part of their household, and keep her safe from the evil queen. But the evil queen hatches a new plan to take care of Snow White once and for all. I'll be honest, I didn't realise just how old the original Grimm's Fairy Tale version of Snow White was. 1812 is when this was initially published. So when I say that this is a classic fairy tale, I mean it. But even with that said, this is not the most faithful adaptation of that story. In fact, the original Brothers Grimm Fairy Tale version of Snow White has a lot more that happens in it, and it is much darker. I'll admit it's not quite as dark as things like Sleeping Beauty or Cinderella in my opinion, but it is still significantly darker than the animated movie. In the Grimm's version of this story, the evil queen doesn't want Snow White's heart, she wants her liver and lungs. And when the huntsman returns with a boar's liver and lungs, the queen has her cook roast and salt them, which she then eats. Because why not? Snow White herself is a lot younger in that version of the story, and she spends years with the dwarves. The queen actually has 3 attempts to kill Snow White over the course of the story. The first one involving a bodice, the second one involving a poison comb, and the third one involving the apple. The prince doesn't meet Snow White until after she's died, and he becomes weirdly obsessed with her. There's no magic kiss in that version of the story. What it is that wakes Snow White up is an accident happens and it dislodges the poison apple that's still in her throat. And after Snow White and the prince get married, the evil queen shows up once again to try and kill Snow White. And obviously she doesn't succeed, she's captured, and the prince orders her to wear these red hot iron slippers and dance until she dies. So yeah, it's not exactly for kids. So I do understand the idea to not only streamline the story but make it a lot more family friendly, or using today's terminology and Disneyfying it. The funny thing is though, This has become the most influential version of this story, to the point where so many adaptations of Snow White borrow elements from this version rather than the Grimm Fairy Tale. Which on the one hand I do think is a little bit of a shame, because I do think that if they adapted the Grimm Fairy Tale it would stand out from the other adaptations. But at the same time, it just goes to show just how impactful and influential this film was. And yes, I will openly say that Disney's animated Snow White is still a really good and charming film that absolutely deserved all the accolades that it got. And obviously, yes, this movie being created in the 1930s, it does have a few elements that are a little bit dated by today's standards. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find a movie that came out back then that hasn't. But with that said, this movie does still have a timeless quality, and it does still capture the imagination. The story itself is very simple and easy to follow, especially with all the changes that it's made to the plot, and it is so memorable. Seriously, as I have said, I have not seen this movie in a very long time, but with that said, I still remember more or less everything that happens in this. Now alright, not a lot does happen in this movie, but even so, the changes to the original source material do work quite well. It does maintain that fantasy vibe, and it is accessible to all audiences. And even though this is a lot more child friendly than the fairy tale, it doesn't shy away from the darker moments, and it does have a few sequences that are tense or genuinely emotional, like the really trippy sequence when Snow White is running through the dark forest, or the glass coffin sequence at the end. It's balanced out really well, and it never lets the comedic, lighter or darker elements overshadow the other. It works really well, the pacing is nice, and the runtime absolutely breezes past. It hits every single important plot point, and it still finds time to have a little bit of fun. I honestly forgot just how funny this movie can be, especially some of the stuff that the dwarfs get up to. There's some really good slapstick and verbal gags. It's really funny. I also actually forgot just how long Snow White is in the glass coffin for. There's a little text bubble that pops up on screen, and you see the seasons changing behind it before the prince shows up. Also, while I'm on the subject, sorry about this, can any of you tell me what it is, word for word, what it is that breaks the curse? Now I guarantee that most of you watching this will say true love's kiss, because that's what it always is. Except in this, it isn't. In this, it is stated by the evil queen that the only thing that can lift the curse is love's first kiss. I'm not entirely sure where the original phrase true love's kiss comes from, but it definitely wasn't this, and I'll openly admit I got it wrong as well. It's a petty thing to focus on, I know, I'm sorry. Let's move on. A large part of the charm of this movie is easily the characters, all of whom manage to be memorable in their own different ways, even if they have limited amounts of screen time. First of all, the character designs and costumes. They are so iconic and feel both individual and unique, especially the dwarfs who, yes, their costumes are pretty much the same outside of colour differences, but it's their character designs. All of them are designed in a way that not only helps differentiate them, but it helps emphasise their key characteristics. Doc quite obviously has glasses, Grumpy has quite angled eyebrows, Happy looks quite big and jolly, Dopey with his big ears and oversized clothes. It's really good, and it helps make each of them feel unique. And in the Evil Queen's case, mainly when she transforms into the hag, kinda scary and creepy. Her queen gear though is pretty iconic. It is quite simple, but it is recognisable, and I love how her colour scheme contrasts with Snow White's. The Evil Queen's costume consists mainly of purple and black colours, the colours of villainy. Snow White's costume consists of primary colours, which not only helps her stand out from the background, it subtly shows that she's good. The Snow White look is easily the most iconic of all the Disney princesses. An argument can be made for a few others, but that image of Snow White in the forest in that costume, everyone knows. It's kind of insane seeing the initial designs that Disney came up with for this version of Snow White, because at one point in time she could have looked so differently from what we actually got. I mean, at one point there was actually a design where she was blonde and had a pink dress. I am curious how the movie would have turned out if they had stuck with those initial designs, but what it is that we did get, how Snow White does look in this movie, I wouldn't change. In terms of the actual characters themselves, there's not a lot to them. They are quite simple and they do have pretty basic motivations, but you need to take into account that there are a lot of characters that do appear throughout this movie, and the runtime for it is quite short, so they're not able to do too much with them. But what it is that they have done with these characters within the runtime that they have is make them not only likeable, but make them easy to understand and empathise with no matter what age you are. Snow White herself, voiced by Adriana Caselotti, often gets criticised as a character for being a bit too innocent and naive. And I get where the criticism comes from, but people tend to forget that she's young and she's been sheltered most of her life. And yet, in spite of that, and the fact that her stepmother, the Evil Queen, was the one who forced her to, she is still kind, she's still caring and considerate. She's even got a sense of humour. Plus, despite the upbringing that she's had, she is a much better mother figure to these 7 people that she's never met before than her own stepmother was to her. She may not change as a character over the course of the movie, she doesn't really have a character arc as such, but she does have a positive impact on the people and the world around her, including the animals. So yes, even though I don't think that she's the greatest character, I would not say that she is either bland or lacks character. I do like her, and I do think that she is an important part of the Disney princess lineup. And as for the 7 dwarfs, I love these characters and they are easily the best part of the movie, at least in my opinion. Voiced by Eddie Collins, Pinto Colvig, Billy Gilbert, Otis Harlan and Scotty Matraw, they are lively, they are entertaining and genuinely funny, and I love the chemistry between them all. Dark, happy, sneezy, grumpy, dopey, sleepy and bashful, they feel like a proper family or really close friends, and they all bounce off each other really well. And I've only just very recently found this out, but the voice performers actually voiced multiple characters and provided sound effects for them as well. There's even voice performers that worked on this movie that did exclusively animal noises. That's pretty cool. And again, they were uncredited. Anyway, the dwarfs also provide a big part of the emotional core of the film. They get you to laugh and smile, but during the glass coffin segment, they are the reason that you cry. Grumpy especially, who is this movie's secret weapon. He is so against the idea of Snow White staying with them in the cottage and becoming a part of their family, but he is the first person to spring into action when she's in danger. And I'll be honest, that shot of Grumpy towards the end of the movie where he's in tears, that is a proper gut punch. It's very subtle and simple emotional manipulation, but it is very effective. The dwarfs are brilliant characters. They may not be the ones to wake Snow White up, but they are heroes for fighting off the evil queen. I can't really say too much about the prince in this movie because he only actually appears in 2 scenes. And he barely does anything. He doesn't even have a name. His vocal performance from Harry Stockwell is good, and apparently there was a lot of cut content involving the prince, where he would have been captured by the Queen, imprisoned, and then have to fight his way out. But it wasn't completely discarded, because this whole section was actually used a lot later in a different Disney movie for Prince Philip in Sleeping Beauty. In my opinion, I do think that it works a lot better and it does make a lot more sense in that movie, but it does at least make sense why it is that it takes so long for the prince to arrive at the end of this film. Now, I do need to address one thing, and that's the debate surrounding the prince not getting consent to kiss Snow White when she's in the coffin. Look, first off, this movie is fictional, it's a fairy tale. Secondly, Snow White has openly said that she is in love with him a lot earlier on in the movie. In fact, she has a whole song built around it. And thirdly, do you really want to see a 90-year-old prince standing next to the decomposing corpse of Snow White, still exposed in a glass coffin, turning to the camera and saying, "Well, she still hasn't given me consent yet. Oh!" I don't think anyone wants to see that. Maybe the Blood and Honey team, but normal people not so much. Anyway, and as for the evil queen, voiced by Lucille Laverne, she is iconic. Everything about her, from the look, her presence, the performance and her motivation, it's so memorable and really stands out against so many of the other villains in Disney's lineup. And I've got to admit that the voice performance from Lucille Laverne was that good that I was convinced that the evil queen and the hag were voiced by 2 completely different people. She voices them both. She is absolutely amazing, and she absolutely earns the title of Evil Queen. Also, a shout out to Stu Buchanan as the Huntsman and Maroney Olsen as the Magic Mirror. They are just as memorable as everyone else, even in their limited roles. I will say, some of the performances from some of the cast members do feel quite theatrical and exaggerated, but that was quite normal for movies back then. I'd imagine the reason being that most actors back then were trained up as theatre actors, so I would imagine that they would bring that training over into the movies. Movies were still quite new at the time, but I don't know for 100% certainty, so don't quote me on it. The performances are very grand, big and extravagant, and there's lots of posing as well. Like whenever Snow White's moving around with like this sort of dance-like motion, she often pauses and she's often doing like lots of little poses and stuff like that. But I also think that part of the reason for that is due to the animation techniques that Disney were using at the time. Disney Animation pioneered something called cell animation, and that's a technique that they used for this movie. And it's basically a way of being able to craft out a sequence a lot quicker because all of the pieces on screen are separated. So rather than having to draw the background in every single frame, every single shot, which some animation movies and shorts were doing at the time, celluloid animation actually breaks it up so the background is always there and it's always consistent and doesn't need changing. And then the characters, animals and objects are painted onto these celluloid windows and placed in front of the background. That's why, like, if you watch something like The Simpsons, for instance, and there's always like that sort of shadow just behind them, that's why. It's a technique that is still being used to this day, and Disney were the ones that pioneered it. It looks amazing in this movie. The artwork itself is absolutely gorgeous and very highly detailed, and because it's using celluloid animation to bring this movie to life, it does add a sense of depth. And the reason why Snow White and the Evil Queen move quite realistically in this movie is because they use a technique called rotoscoping. And rotoscoping is basically a form of tracing where an image is projected onto one of the celluloid windows, and then one of the artists traces out one of the characters. I call it cheating? I don't really. So that basically means that they had actors actually coming into the studio in costume and acting out the entire movie, and the artists used that as reference footage, and then they're able to draw over it and make it look more like the characters. There is footage of the stuff that they did record on set out there, and if you are interested, it is out there and it is worth seeing. It does look good, and it is still impressive just how lifelike this movie can be, including the animals, but it still maintains that cartoonish quality, and that's mostly obvious when it comes to the dwarfs. They are quite lively and bouncy, and they do feel like animated characters. This is an absolutely stunning looking movie. The shadows and shading really make the colours pop on screen in a really vivid way. The framing and the artistry is absolutely gorgeous. I absolutely think that there are scenes in this movie that are purely there to show off what it is that the animators can do, and that definitely includes the sound design too. Sound and music being integrated into a movie was still quite a new thing when this movie was released, but an animated movie that was completely synced up to sound effects, music and dialogue, that was impressive. And it was all in colour as well. It still is, because admittedly I have absolutely no idea how it is that they synced up the lip movements to the characters whenever they're talking in these kind of films. It's so much easier to do today. It is still brilliant, and I love how the music complements both the sound effects and the beats. The soundtrack for this movie was composed by Frank Churchill, Lee Harline, Paul Smith and Edward H. Plum, and I personally wouldn't say that the songs and music were the greatest to come from a Disney animated movie, but they are memorable. Some of them still stand out as some of Disney's most iconic songs, like Hi Ho or Whistle While You Work. Whether you've seen this movie or not, everyone knows those songs. The music is beautifully composed, the songs are catchy and so iconic, and they are all a good chunk of the reason why it is that this movie is so memorable. Overall, and almost 90 years on, this movie still has the power to charm. It may not be the greatest or most complex Disney animated movie in terms of story, but its characters, the designs and music, the art design, sound and voice performances help make this remain a brilliant film, an absolute classic and a must-watch family film. It may be dated in some areas, but even so, this film changed the game for animation, silenced the naysayers and helped craft and build a legacy that is still going strong today. It may not be my favourite of Disney's animated movies, but I do like it, I do think that it is a good film, and I do think that this is something that everyone should at least watch. So with all that being said, my rating for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is a 9 out of 10. Well, that is pretty much everything I want to say for this video, so if you have watched this video, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoy this content, please like, subscribe and be sure to hit that notification button. If you have seen Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, let me know down in the comments what you think about it. Plus, if you have any suggestions for any future Rewind reviews you would like to see me do, let me know down below. But until next time, thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you in the next video. See you guys.